My name is Natalie Kendrick, and today I'm going to be talking a little bit about game-based learning, which has been my career for the past few years. I got my let me go here. I got my start in mobile games, basically since the day I turned 18, and maybe lying a little bit before then. I worked in kind of romance mobile games, game sims, choose your own adventure style things. At the time when that market was beginning to kind of boom. And then for 2 years, I wrote animation scripts for the Minecraft YouTuber Athmel, which were geared towards 12-year-old girls, so that was a little bit different. And then for the last 2 years, I have been an educational game designer at the University of Oklahoma's K-20 Center, which is a grant-funded institution focusing on making materials for public schools, specifically for Oklahoma public schools, but our resources are used worldwide and across the nation in many public schools in the U.S. My official title is Interactive Learning Designer, but that's a fancy title for game designer. A little bit about the K-20 Center. Like I said, it's funded by DERA, which is a national initiative for improving test scores, most importantly, but secondary, educating the children. Despite our focus on local and particularly rural Oklahoma schools, like I said, our resources are used all over the world. And then we have several award-winning games that we've made as sort of a side project to the overall goal of the institution, which is sort of grouped into our video game portal, which is the K-20 portal. We have over 15 games, and we have 1,500 schools that actively use our stuff, and over 3,000, I think, that have just signed up with users. And like I said, those aren't focused in Oklahoma, those are worldwide. I wanted to draw attention to some of our games before I get started into this. Mind Your Budget is probably our biggest game. It is a financial literacy game, and it's required to graduate high school in Oklahoma. So lots of kids are in that one. Operation Elect is our newest game. We finished it right before the last election cycle, and it's somehow a non-political game about how the political system works. And then Get a Life is probably our second most popular game, which is technically non-educational, and it's more about like choosing colleges and making life choices and balancing work and relaxation. And that one is used primarily in like school therapy and guidance counselors and remedial courses, just to help kids sort of transition out of high school into their main life. And then we've got a whole bunch of ones ranging from language arts to science to math. We like to keep it pretty broad. So I'm going to start talking about our goal for today, which is kind of walking through how to design an educational game in 2025. So an educational game in the world of education, these are called serious games, which is kind of a silly title for the fact that teachers get scared when they see the word video game used in an educational context, so we call them serious games. But you're probably familiar with them, just known as educational games. Their primary purpose is to teach or train through gameplay. And the kind of idea of them as an effective tool is that they ground the education and the learning content into like context, and they help with retention because you're kind of seeing it in like a practical, hands-on way. You may be familiar with Oregon Trail or Mavis Weekend Teaches Typing. These are kind of the OGs of educational games. If you are specifically me and specifically my age, you may remember these, which you could buy as 3 packs in Costco. And that's how I learned a lot of my math in 4th to 6th grade. But Today, I'm going to talk to you about kind of the modern idea of the educational game process. We're going to go through just establishing the learning goal, choosing a game mechanic or genre, integrating that mechanic with the learning goal, writing the game, making the game, and evaluating the game. So the game I'm going to be using as an example for kind of the content of this pathway is a game I made called 6 Nights at Diodati. It is an HTML5 browser-based game about Mary Shelley creating Frankenstein, and specifically the kind of 6 nights that she spent in a ghost story competition that led to the creation of course, one of the greatest American or British novels of all time, and largely considered the first sci-fi novel of all time. So, step 1 is the learning goal. This one's pretty self-explanatory. It's what information do you want the players to walk away from the game with? And specifically for my work, when we're developing things for the American public school system, we have established national standards that have like a little letter and a little number. And so you can pull those specifically when we're pitching the game to go like, this meets these standards. So if the teacher is to present this game in the class, then the teacher can knock those standards off their list of things that they need to cover. So that's something to keep in mind if you ever want to pitch an educational game as something to be funded, either by the government or by some generous single donor, but probably the government. Making sure that you keep those standards in mind is important. So Diodati's learning goal was to unveil the context and influences of Frankenstein. Short and simple, but that's kind of broad. So I kind of nailed that down to 3 specific things. One is circumstance, kind of the infamous story of her participating in this ghost story contest. And that is just sort of general knowledge that should be known. Influences is a little harder to pin down because there's a list. I made a list of about 25 influences that went into Frankenstein. And if you're studying Frankenstein, it's important to know those little bits and pieces that were figuratively sewn together to form Frankenstein. And then the last one is probably the most vague, but I'm a big proponent of socio-emotional learning, kind of connecting to the student on like an emotional level. And so I wanted to, for the potential player of this, to view Mary Shelley and friends that she's trapped in this mansion with writing this ghost story as sort of living beings with conflicts and dreams and interpersonal dynamics in a way that, one, I find just generally engaging as a narrative, but two, being important to visualize Mary Shelley as a living being rather than just like a name they have to learn about. Next step is going to be choosing your mechanics. So once you have what you want the children, or in this case of this game, I wanted to shoot for high school, maybe early college age. At the K-20 Center, we cover, it's called K-20 because we cover from kindergarten to 2 years into high school, or 2 years into college, so age 20. So choosing the mechanic means that you have to choose what kind of genre of game. You don't have to like reinvent the wheel. You can just kind of come up with something, like the development of a game. You kind of come up with something that's been done before and then tweak it to what it needs to be. So when I started at my current job, my boss told me, whatever the hell you do, don't just staple a quiz onto an unrelated game. So whatever you do, don't make it like a tower defense game that every so often a question pops up and you have to click A, B, or C, and then, get bonus ammo or something. It's not engaging. The kids are more focused on the tower defense part, and in general, it's just not conducive to giving like a concrete foundation of whatever concept you're trying to convey. So you end up with these different tracks. You've got your educational content. I've described it as often dry, protein-rich educational content. This is what you want them to walk away with. And then you've got the shell of the gameplay, which is the fun part, the part that they're actually here for. But ideally, you find a way to blend these two different tracks together in a way that they can't be distinguished from one another. So I began to look at my 3 goals and then kind of allowed those to influence what kind of game vaguely I wanted to look at. So for circumstance, I knew that I wanted this, like, whatever the game ended up being, I knew I wanted this frame narrative of this competition. And it just so happened that what I was trying to do with Mary Shelley's ghost story competition kind of lends itself to a game itself, right? There's a time limit, there's a goal, there's a fail state. It's handy in this case. I wanted to make sure that all of my 25 listed influences were covered. This is a little bit trickier because in all the books that she read and the experiences that she had that influenced her are kind of dry and boring. And so I wanted there to be like literary discussion and dialogue and room for interaction in sort of a conversational place rather than just listing facts and influences. And finally, for the humanity, I wanted to make Mary Shelley and friends very like well-rounded characters. And that can be kind of tricky because then it delves into historical fiction, but I figured I would sacrifice some like cold, hard scientific facts of who Mary Shelley was to be like a more fully fledged character. My baseline for that was Liberty Kids, if anybody, once again, if you are specifically my age. And so I kind of looked at everything that I generally wanted and was like, okay, we've got this frame narrative with stakes, but we also have like a lot of focus on discussion and a lot of focus on character. And so I decided to make a platonic dating sim, which is you play as Mary Shelley and you talk with Prissy Shelley, who is her soon-to-be husband. Also trapped in the mansion is her stepsister. Also trapped in the mansion is Lord Byron, and then Lord Byron's weird doctor. And so there's all these characters that you can be having conversations with, and I wanted to give the player some agency in terms of like when and where and how they have those conversations. My primary influence was the Japanese-only dating sim Tokimeki Memorial. I'm a big fan of the series. I think it's great. But I specifically chose it because it's based on stats. And so you have to raise your stats with certain characters and certain attributes to trigger scenes. And I really liked that because when you trigger those dialogue scenes, they feel like a reward. And they feel like you want to read them because you worked for them. And that was kind of, I thought that gameplay would suit this well because turning kind of the dry influence chat into a reward kind of sells it a little bit more. Which brings us to part 3, developing the mechanics. So now that we have our established genre, we can start to work with the kind of archetypical components of that and tweak them and work with them and mold with them to suit our needs for this specific game. And like I said before, this kind of falls into general game design facts, which is, if you want to make a roguelite, you start with a roguelite, and then you can kind of make it your own. But it's good to have the knowledge and the experience to have that foundation. So I'm going to go through some of the classic dating sim mechanics I chose for Diodati, and then how I kind of shaped them to suit my learning goal. Step 1, classic dialogue tree. This was sort of the more first step for me, which is I want Mary to be able to speak. I want the player to feel as if they embody her, and I want to convey sort of her historically categorized personality, where she's like a little spunky, she's a little bit punk rock for her time, a little goth, she's in this mansion with her boyfriend Percy. They have a child out of wedlock. She's very ahead of her time, and I wanted to embody that with some player agency. So this is sort of the first thing I implemented, both in terms of concept and then coding. The next thing is something that I referenced a little bit earlier, which is stat balancing. And there's a couple different stats here. This menu looks a little sparse, but everything, I tried a very visual menu because words scare children. But everything is sort of explained in the tutorial, but I'll kind of walk you through some of the ideas for stats. So down below, you see kind of elements of Frankenstein. There's a little finger there for science. There's a needle and thread for sort of family matters and domesticity. There's a skull for gothicness, and then there's a heart, a bleeding heart for romanticism. And I sort of established these four things as kind of the larger groupings of themes in Frankenstein. And these are the sort of the core stats that Mary will be building or using. And essentially, if you want to build affection with any character, you can click on them. You get like a short scene, they'll build some affection. And if you want to improve any of the stats, you click on those and your stats will go up or down. And then once you hit a certain threshold of both proficiency in that stat and affection with the character, a scene will trigger, like I said, kind of triggering that ideal reward. Now, you may notice two other elements, which is at the bottom, there's a clock and a day. As the title might imply, there is a time limit of 7 days and 6 nights. And so you have a constant sense of ticking pressure. I'm going to give you guys a little bit of a hint. It's very difficult to lose this game. It makes you feel good, but I wanted to instill a sense of pressure, even if the fail state is very difficult to obtain. And then most importantly, on the bottom right there, you'll see what I refer to as the William meter. She has a child named William. And as you sort of hang out with people and develop your stats, his need bar will rise. And if you don't take care of him, Percy will get mad at you. And nobody wants Percy Shelley mad at you. He's a nice guy. And so you have to balance taking care of your child with writing largely considered the first and maybe the greatest sci-fi novel of all time. Classic being a woman in the 1800s kind of thing. And that is sort of the main UI in terms of it's simple, but there's pressure and there's a sense of making number go up for reward, and hopefully, ideally, it feels good to play. So the next thing mechanic I came up with was the idea of the influence map, which is after you finish any sort of small scene that you've earned as a reward with any of the characters, you get a little pop-up that tells you sort of what that conversation was about and how it connects to the other things that you've discussed. And so you discover two things that are similar. They will both sort of emerge into this black kind of void that represents Mary's mind castle, so to speak, and a little line will be marked between them, and you can sort of start to piece together something approximating, perhaps, these disparate ideas and how they're knitting together into the concept of Frankenstein. Finally, I touched on this briefly before, but I really wanted a sense of time pressure, and particularly within that sense of time pressure, I wanted interruptions. And so every day you start out and you have to have breakfast, and you have to deal with Lord Byron every day at breakfast, and he's always badgering you whether or not you're done with your story. And then you can spend some time, free run, talk to people, raise your stats, and then you got to do a little dinner. And then you got some time after that, and then it's bedtime. There's a scene every single night where you have to talk to Percy about what you learned that day. And so there's stretches of independence kind of intentionally broken up by these interruptions that I both intended to kind of give the player a break from having to make decisions for a second, but also just to make them feel like time is of the essence. So running out, and now this has to happen. It takes 2 hours of my time, just to give a little bit of push and of pull. Step 4. Writing the game. This is a language arts game, which means there's a lot of writing. I liked establishing all the characters. I liked kind of getting everybody's voices set and what everybody's interpersonal dynamics are. But the kind of meat and potatoes of this was just sitting down and writing 15,000 words, which is, a novella unto itself. But that's particularly long because very little of this is prose and most of it is dialogue. And most of it is kind of little tiny broken up scenes that you can unlock slowly but surely. Even though the game is not that long and the average player won't see all 15,000 of those, I wanted it to be there in case, I wanted there to be enough content that the over-eager player will be able to find everything if they so wish. We were bringing our Operation Elect game around to local schools as sort of a test, just to see how children respond to it. There would be kids that would beat one level and go like, all right, I did my job. I've put in my 20% for the day and I'm good to go. And then some kids would just voraciously yeah, and there's nothing you can really control as a designer in terms of how ambitious children are in school, because those are often social factors and family factors that you can't control. But I always like to have enough room and enough road that if the kid wants to run and take off, they can go as far as they want. We had like a 5-level game that was like an election simulator, and it started with a local election and ended with the presidency. And when we were testing it, we hadn't made the 5th level yet. And we weren't expecting anybody to get there. And then all of a sudden, this kid raised his hand. We were like 20 minutes into this, and was like, I've eaten everything. Why on the 5th level unlocking? Like we weren't planning on you to get there. But it's always really gratifying when you see someone take something and run with it. Step 5, making the game. This was a solo project just done in my free time. It wasn't actually associated with the University of Oklahoma because we make kind of big team-based games. But it still required sitting down, working with what was on my design document, working with my script, changing things, as I'm sure you guys are familiar, being game makers yourself. Everything doesn't go to plan, and also I often think about the Deus Ex 2 team that just put up these giant poster boards in their room of like everything that was going to happen in the game, and then they made everything word for word off of what they planned in the beginning, and then the opening of the game was 2 hours long, and we only get to shoot for about 5 minutes of that, and they were like, well, too late now. So it's important to kind of have that back and forth with what you've created. I think especially true for educational content because engagement is always important, but engagement with children when the content is maybe dry is especially important to making sure you're not slowing down anywhere. I actually, in this game, I cut the entire first scene because I was like, we got to get to the gameplay faster. We gotta get these kids pressing buttons. And so it becomes a matter of flexibility when you're making a game like this. I don't really have any additional slides on this because everybody making the game looks a little bit different, but the goal is just to not be too hard on yourself, not be too steadfast in what you've planned, and just making sure that you're open to inspiration as it comes to you. I also wanted to talk briefly about accessibility in the video game designs or educational game space. I chose HTML5 because it's browser-based, and you can pull it up on mobile. As you've seen from my screenshots that I've been presenting, they're all vertical. I chose to shoot for a phone-based thing or a tablet-based experience. But for most educational games, it's actually going to be probably a horizontal screen and probably going to be a Chromebook. So a very low-powered device where things cannot be downloaded onto. So we have to choose browser. That is not universal, especially in high school and early college settings. People are going to have access to their own devices, but for anything below that, very much a Chromebook-heavy environment. And then I also wanted to point out the importance of targeting clarity and directness. This goes for both the actual accessibility of the game in terms of making sure that it's screen reader accessible. That is legally required if it's going to be in a public school setting. Making sure that there's colorblind modes, making sure that there's maybe font options, which is not something I included in this game, but it's nice to have. And then on a less legal definition of accessibility, just making sure that your tutorial is direct and clear and ideally not too long. The chances, we once did a test with high schoolers, and we could see one of the markers that we put in our sort of tracker software as the children were playing the game was who skipped the tutorial by clicking very fast. 73%. Insane. And so that's something to keep in mind as well. So if they skip the tutorial, is the mechanic still somewhat self-projected, somewhat legible? Step 5 is going to be evaluation. As I just mentioned, we at the University of Oklahoma, we always put in trackers into our games for our test boards so that when we take them to classrooms, we can see what children click on, what children click through, how they interact, where they get stuck, where they give up. And those are really insightful to sort of view. Obviously, not everyone designing an educational game is going to have access to a classroom to test in, or access to resources to kind of put in those kind of trackers, in which case a lot of time we're just kind of eyeballing it, usually with somebody's kid that you just sort of put it in front of and are like, how do you feel about this? But even if that's the case, it's important to evaluate what in kind of an underdeveloped child's mind they find engaging, what they find boring, and what they end up taking away. Another thing we do, which is not too resource intensive, is we do sort of an exit survey, which they can share their opinions, but also test the material on them. So you can ask questions about the material they were supposed to retain, and ideally, and hopefully, they can retain that. And if they manage to retain that, that will meet the standard that the teacher is looking to teach by having them play this game during class time. So some of the questions that you're probably going to ask yourself is, do the mechanics distract or influence the learning goal? Like I mentioned before, if you've got a tower defense with a quiz stapled on it, the quiz questions popping up are going to interrupt what they're actually trying to play, which is the tower defense game. I keep using this example because it's a really good one I once played in the classroom. And that means that the mechanics themselves are a distraction from the knowledge that they are supposed to be retaining. And it isn't integrated, and it isn't influencing the material in any way whatsoever. And because of that, you lose the context, you lose the kind of cementing and the foundation that the game design is supposed to be helping with. And then, does the game hold attention? This is kind of self-explanatory, but it's harder than you think. Kids in a classroom context, a lot of times, there's so many things about it that aren't in control, down to being in the class, playing this in the class after lunch and everyone's kind of sleepy. So your goal is to be attention grabbing, but because it is a quote unquote serious game, you don't want to be obnoxious. And also, if you try to be obnoxious, the kids can tell. We had an election simulator game, and we designed instead of having political factions, we had a dinosaur party and a robot party, and we had these kind of anime style mascots. Kids weren't feeling it. They were probably a little too old, so we ended up toning that down, making it a little more utilitarian in design, and that actually responded better. So it's important to go what is my target audience, and is the tone of what I'm making going to hold their attention. And then lastly and finally, and probably the most importantly, is what the learning goal was the learning goal achieved. So like I said in the exit survey, did they actually learn the material? And ideally, will they remember it either when an actual test comes down the line, or ideally throughout their life, as sort of a foundational piece of knowledge that they can pull up at any time. It's fun to know that Frankenstein was written as a ghost story contest, and it's fun to know that Mary Shelley had all this romantic drama going on while she was writing it. And so that kind of purity of the education itself is what you're going for, and the willingness and interest to hold on to it after it's required in school. So I want to take a second to point out our URL for our game portal. Like I said, we've got over 15 games available there. Several of them are award-winning at several education conferences, and we've done a couple studies that have been published. So we pride ourselves on our games. If you want to give it to a younger sibling, cousin, it's really easy to sign up for, and you get access to everything. It's free and has always been free. We have a generous donor who pays all of our server fees. And then that's going to be it for me until I open up for questions. I talked fast because I'm nervous. You can contact me on my work email there, my number, and then the URL for the K20 Center is there. But I love talking about games in general, and then also just educational games. So if anybody has any questions. Yeah. Right here on the left.
So it's the talk, it was really interesting. I find entertainment to be a very fascinating space in general. I was curious, you mentioned having some experience writing for multiple dating sims, romance games, things like that. Was writing a platonic dating sim, did that harken back to any skills you previously built, or what was that writing process like?
Well, I feel like when you're writing a dating sim, which is what I had the most experience in terms of practical game dev, and there was a lot of focus on having the player make a connection right off the bat with the usually the romantic interest, and so there's this great desire to get on the paper what their deal is, what their conflict might be, what their personality is, and why you might be either romantically or platonically invested in them. And so that was definitely something I was thinking about when I was writing the platonic dating sim, was like, even though this isn't romantic, except with Percy, in which case it is, but he's already established as a romantic figure, is like, almost like, I was actually thinking, almost like a gotcha game, where like, you've got this PNG who supposedly has a personality, and kind of pitching that to the player so that they're engaged with that as soon as possible. Thank you.
What kind of background do you have in like game dev versus like education, and what like drew you to and I also wanted to mention, a lot of us grew up with like flash games on like the Mac games.
Oh, yes.
That's why you're into type and stuff. But I do remember playing an election simulator in middle school on my iPad. I don't know if it's really Excel or if it's helpful, but
Ours is pretty new, but there's a very famous one by whatever the interactive game.
iCivics.
Yes, iCivics is exactly what I was trying to think of. And theirs is like deeply political in a way that I find to be very effective. Now in Oklahoma, they don't want to deal with politics too much, but the iCivics one is excellent. And would you remind me what your first question was?
Yeah, what do you like educational games?
Oh, right.
The people you work with, do they have like educational degrees or are they focused on games? How do you get around?
So my background in college, which I actually dropped out of to take my first writing, like official writing job in Seattle. But my focus there was in English, and then it just so happened that the school I was attending was primarily focused on pumping out English teachers. And so a lot of my classes were focused in kind of the educational space. And then when I moved to Seattle, I worked for that YouTuber for several years, and she was a children's YouTuber. So I spent a lot of time kind of developing content for children. Now, it was still a bit of a leap into educational games, and they definitely hired me as a game writer more and designer more for my video, my education knowledge, but I spent a lot of time working with teachers and classrooms by now that I like the educational side of things. I don't expect to veer away from here anytime soon. But to answer your other question, we work primarily with educators. So most of the people in my office are former teachers or former principals or otherwise involved in the school system. And it's really me, the programmers, and the art team that are like capital G gamers. And so you get a nice little blend there where, kind of half the squad is making the video game and half the squad is maybe not super familiar with video games, but very familiar with how children learn. And so we get to kind of meet in the middle there and collaborate, and usually are successful. Yes, behind.
Yeah, so I guess I have to should I just go for one or
Time for two.
okay.
I talk fast.
So first, I guess it's I find it really interesting doing having like a 6-day writing contest. That's the scenario for a game like this. And I'm wondering about if you're for this sort of like historical reenactment, kind of scenarios. If you're looking for, or if there's a part of a process where you're looking for those. Like I feel like in that era there was a lot of these like salons and like masks, these very sort of artificial like entertainments and things that people come up with. But if you're like looking for those sorts of situations that can map pretty smoothly onto like a game experience.
Yeah. It was definitely nice that when I set out to make this, that the actual historical context was a contest, because that is in its definition a game. And then looking, basically, from what I understand from all the letters I read a lot of letters because I wanted to get everybody's kind of voice and personality correct. the general vibe of those being stormed in for almost a week was that they literally just sat around and read books and talked about science experiments and talked about all the sort of fantastical things. It was a time period where people were really looking towards the future in a way that I feel like we've kind of lost really lately. But it was really fun to kind of encapsulate that vision into the game.
And for follow-up, which is if there's ever any consideration for like different like starting points for the players or like where they jump in, so that maybe like students or people can have like a little bit of agency even before they get into it, or like have even if maybe part of the subject they're not interested in from the get, they may have some way to get into it where they can get to the other stuff.
Yeah, this was actually something that I thought a lot about because you want to get people hit the ground running. You want people to sort of get to the action very quickly, but also if they're not familiar with anything about the goal, you run the risk of them feeling lost. In fact, when I gave this game to my little brother, who was at the time 21 years old, he recently turned 22, and he said, "Wow, this is cool. These people feel like real people." I said, "What do you mean?" He was like, "Yeah, this is unique characters you've made," and I was like, "Do you know who Mary Shelley is?" He's a finance major. And he was like, "Oh, yeah." And I said, "Do you know what she wrote?" And he was like, "No." And so I genuinely took that feedback as like, well, maybe I should put something at the beginning that establishes like what Frankenstein is and kind of introduces us in that way. And I mentioned a little bit earlier that I had this whole sort of introduction where they were like on the lakeside walking to the mansion and like a storm was rolling in. It was very aesthetic and it set a vibe, but ultimately it was a lot to click through to get to the gameplay. So my sort of general advice of what I learned from that would be as close to the gameplay as possible without losing context. Did you have a question?
Yeah, when you talk about the learning goal and the mechanic, your team have some thought about the duration of the game and the time to deliver that goal and the usage of the mechanic, and when you're thinking about in a more formal education setting?
Yeah, so with this game, since it was more of like a passion personal project that I wanted to make, I didn't have anything too concrete other than I wanted to implement a save system where if they got bored, they could always come back. So it's a game that I think can be played in probably one session, but 2 or 3 if needed. When you're making a game for a classroom, you want to be very explicit about time limits because usually the teacher has 1 or 2 class periods booked out for this. And so we host our games additionally on a platform called Learn, K20's Learn. And that very clearly states, hey, this is a 60-minute game, 2 class periods. So these specific grades covering this topic, covering these standards. So we try and make it as easy as possible for teachers to kind of plan out their whole class plan. And along with that, it's always a little bit different because some kids move through things slower, some kids like to read, some kids like to click through. But in general, I recommend like, hey, this level will take you 15 minutes. There's 6 levels. Do with that information what you will.
You get gather the stat on how the kids perform.
We do. Yeah, we try and track playtime, and we try and track like how long it takes a kid to reach a level, how long they retry the level, and when they give up, if they give up.
And like for a question.
Yeah.
I was curious, and this might come across as a loaded question, but I made it from sort of more of a place of curiosity, is making games for like the public school system. Do you ever run into issues of like censorship or like I don't know if a public school would want to like show the fact that Mary Shelley had a kid out of bed, example
Mm.
of the game, and I know this is a passive project, but
No, this kind of falls in line with I was talking a little bit about the iCivics game, which deals very much so with the politics of like what the two electoral parties, what their platforms are, what they believe, what they don't believe in. And when we set out to make our election simulator game, the director of our institution came to us and was like, "Hey, we need to keep things real neutral." And so the questions in the game became things like, oh, there's like a highway project and some people are against the highway and some people are for the highway. And it's made even more prickly by the fact that we're in Oklahoma, and Oklahoma is actually the only state that doesn't require the national standards. They have their own personal set of standards that are very close, but not quite. And so we have to keep those in mind as well. And so it's a little depressing, but yes, we do struggle a lot of times. We butt up against those kind of things, which is why I like to make more personal projects that are a little bit more out there. I personally believe that high school students can handle a lot more than what senators think they can handle. But in general, if we can say that it's for 11th and 12th grade, usually we can get away with a little bit more.
for some project, is there anywhere we can like cut it out?
So my dream, and as game developers, I'm sure you can relate to this, my dream is to have it available by the end of this thing, but things get shifty.
1998.
Yeah. So it's almost done. It's just got some bug fixes. I wish I had put on social media, but perhaps someday we'll see it floating on itch.
I was wondering about the birth of the rodeo kingdom because it feels like a very different mechanic than everything else in the game. And I was wondering, like, was that around from like there's a first iteration, or did you decide that that had some enough influence that you needed to add a different way that for that, or what was the vibe?
So my inspiration game for this was Tokimeki Memorial, and which sadly doesn't have an English translation, but is an excellent game. And something that is a part of that game is that there's a stress meter. And so as you're like living your high school life and dating girls and, you know, being an athlete or whatever you want to do in the game, the stress meter slowly starts to rise. And it's very effective. They're very simple to resolve by just resting a day or so. It's effective in kind of giving a little bit of tension. And as it wasn't originally there, but as I was sort of beginning to like test the game, I was like, hey, it's just clicking buttons. There's not enough, all video games are clicking buttons, but the idea is to sort of give some gravitas to the button clicking. And so I felt like it needed a little bit more tug of war. Yeah, we got time.
But so for people that are just developing like independent games like this, how do you test this several programs that you're looking at, and how do you suggest that other people find like audiences that are younger to
a lot of the preliminary testing for this that I did sort of before I'm in my final kind of bug fixing tweaking stage, but I honestly crowdsourced people's sentences. I got a lot of friends also in their 20s, and a lot of them have, late high school, either cousins or siblings, and I was able to be like, hey, can you bully whatever child is in your life? And tell me what they think about this game. So the power of Twitter or Blue Sky is very much a part of my work ethic. I think that maybe.
It's here for the Christopher.
Thank you.